Hi, Susan here. So this video is about the origin of demons, where they are today. Very interesting. Obviously by Pastor Chris, taken from Your Love World specials in October 2024. So Pastor Chris talks about how through effective prayer, we can combat spiritual forces and actively engage with and overcome spiritual opposition. We have the authority to effect change as we are seated in heavenly places. Let's listen to an excerpt.
You have to know that you can actually do something about your city, your state, your country, your family, your business, your work, your finances. You are not at the mercy of anyone.
I hope that's got you interested in the topic. Let's listen to two speakers discussing the sermon.
Welcome back, everybody. Today we're diving into something pretty fascinating, a sermon that explores the influence of demonic forces throughout history, and it even gets into how those forces could be tied to things happening today.
Yeah.
Are you ready to kind of unpack this with me?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this sermon really presents a very different way of looking at things.
Mhm.
You know, it makes you think about the possibility that there are unseen forces at work in the world, and I think that raises some interesting questions for sure.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So the sermon starts by taking us all the way back to the Old Testament
Yeah.
and, the concept of sons of God.
Great.
Now, there are, a lot of different ways to interpret that term, but in this sermon, it's talking about angels who were given the job of watching over different nations.
Okay.
Like they were these guardians in a sense. But here's where it gets interesting. Some of these watcher angels, as they're called, they kind of strayed from their duties, you could say.
Yeah, and according to the sermon, that's straying had some pretty big consequences. It says that these fallen angels actually fathered giants,
Mhm.
and these giants, they corrupted the early civilizations and like paved the way for these demonic entities to emerge.
Wow.
And the sermon paints this picture of ancient cultures unknowingly worshiping these demonic figures as gods, offering them sacrifices, and just completely unaware that they were actually perpetuating this this demonic influence.
So you're saying like there was this whole hidden spiritual drama going on in the background of ancient history?
That's what the sermon suggests, yeah.
That's wild. Okay, so then the sermon moves on to a big turning point, the arrival of Christianity.
Right.
How did that change things in terms of this spiritual power struggle?
Well, the sermon presents the coming of Christianity as like this huge shift in the whole spiritual landscape.
Mhm.
It really highlights how the early church directly challenged and confronted these demonic forces. And you see this all over the Bible stories of Jesus casting out demons and Paul having this confrontation with the demonic entity over in Ephesus. The sermon is suggesting that these acts of spiritual warfare were a major reason for the decline of idol worship and the transformation of societies.
So early Christians were like on the front lines battling these demonic forces. And that had a ripple effect that changed the world around them.
That's how the sermon frames it, yeah.
Fascinating. Okay, so we've gone from these guardian angels to fallen angels to the rise of Christianity and its impact on the spiritual battlefield. But then the sermon takes a bit of a darker turn. It starts suggesting that these demonic forces could be making a comeback.
Mhm.
How does it explain that?
It uses this really interesting analogy from the Gospel of Matthew where it talks about an empty, swept, and garnished house.
Okay.
And it's referring to someone who's been freed from demonic influence.
Right.
But the thing is, if that person doesn't fill their life with something positive, with faith and spiritual grounding, then these demonic forces can actually come back stronger than before.
So are you saying that Christianity's success in pushing back against these demonic forces might have unintentionally opened the door for their return?
That's the idea the sermon is exploring.
Yeah.
The decline of spiritual fervor in churches. The move away from traditional beliefs and practices. The sermon argues that all of this has created an opening for those demonic forces to creep back in.
It's definitely a thought-provoking concept. So if these forces are really making a comeback, how are they showing up in the world today?
Well, that's where the sermon gets really specific and, to be honest, a little controversial.
Oh, let's hear it.
It argues that major companies and organizations are being influenced by these demonic forces now, with the goal of controlling nations and suppressing free speech. And it even names specific entities like the World Economic Forum, the World Health Organization, and certain financial institutions. Yeah. It's claiming that these organizations, through their actions and agendas, are actually advancing the interests of these unseen forces.
That's a pretty bold claim. How does it tie that back to what we were talking about before with the ancient idea of demons and their influence?
It draws this parallel between the ancient idea of demons posing as gods and these really powerful groups today.
I see.
It's like just as demons in the past tried to control and manipulate people by acting like deities, the sermon is suggesting that these organizations are now using their influence to control aspects of modern life, often in ways that are harmful or exploitative.
So it's kind of like a modern-day version of that ancient struggle, but instead of idols and temples, we're now talking about corporations and global organizations.
Exactly. The sermon paints this picture of these organizations being like vessels or even puppets for these unseen demonic forces. They're pushing agendas that ultimately benefit those forces, not humanity.
It's a pretty unsettling thought. So if these demonic forces are so widespread, if they're really influencing these powerful organizations, like the sermon says, is there any hope? Is there anything we can do to resist this?
It's not all doom and gloom, though. The sermon actually says that we're not helpless in the face of all this. It says that through faith and their connection to Jesus, believers have the authority to stand up to these demonic forces.
Oh, okay. That's good to hear. So it's not just about recognizing these forces are out there, but also about actually doing something about it.
Exactly. And it even gives some practical steps we can take. It encourages people to pray specifically against the demonic influences they see in their own communities, and it talks about using the name of Jesus to break those influences. It's about taking back that spiritual authority.
It makes me think of what we were talking about before with the early church. You know how they directly challenged the spiritual powers of their time. Is there a connection there, do you think?
I think the sermon is definitely pointing to that. It's calling for like a modern spiritual awakening for people to really step into their faith and actively engage in this spiritual battle.
So what would that look like today? We're not talking about grabbing swords and shields, are we?
No. It's more about recognizing that the challenges we face have a spiritual side and that we need to use spiritual tools to respond. Prayer, fasting, proclaiming truth. Those are the weapons the sermon talks about. It's about spiritual warfare, but in a way that makes sense for our world today.
So instead of fighting literal demons with swords, we're fighting against the demonic influences that show up in things like greed and corruption and suppression of truth.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. The sermon frames it as a battle for hearts and minds, like a battle for the soul of humanity. It's about pushing back against that darkness and fighting for light and truth in every part of our lives.
Okay, but where do we even begin? How do we know what these demonic influences look like in the world?
Well, the sermon talks about discernment. It says we need to pay attention to the motivations and agendas behind the actions of powerful people. It's like asking ourselves, who is benefiting from this? What are they really trying to do? Does this line up with values of love and justice and truth?
So it's not just about accepting what we're told, but actually thinking critically about the information we're given and being aware of how we might be manipulated.
That's a big part of it,
Yeah.
but it also goes beyond that. The sermon says we need to actively promote truth and righteousness, to use our voices and resources and talents to make the world a better place.
So it's not enough to just defend ourselves against the darkness. We also have to actively build something positive to replace it.
Exactly. The sermon describes believers as agents of change, as people who bring light to a world that really needs it. It's about understanding that we have the power individually and together to really make a difference.
This sermon is really giving me a lot to think about. It's definitely challenging, but also inspiring. It's making me wonder if I may be supporting these negative forces without even realizing it, just by being passive or not doing anything.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. Sometimes just staying silent or not taking action can actually make things worse. The sermon is calling us to wake up to this spiritual battle that's going on and to make choices that are in line with our values.
Okay, but let's go back to this idea of large, powerful organizations being influenced by demonic forces. The sermon mentions some specific examples, right? What evidence does it give to back up these claims?
It points to things these organizations are doing, specific actions and policies. It highlights things like efforts to control information and silence people who disagree with them. It talks about agendas that seem to benefit just a small group of people at the expense of everyone else. And it points to examples of corruption, manipulation, and just a total disregard for basic human rights.
So it's not just about the organizations themselves, but about the consequences of what they're doing. It's saying that their actions are a reflection of a deeper spiritual agenda.
Yeah, exactly. The sermon is encouraging us to look beyond the surface, to really understand the motivations and intentions behind what these powerful groups are doing. It's saying that their desire for power and control actually lines up with the goals of these unseen demonic forces.
That's a pretty serious accusation. Isn't there a risk of oversimplifying things here, like blaming everything we don't like on some kind of demonic conspiracy?
I think that's a valid concern, and the sermon does say that we need to be discerning. It's not saying every bad thing that happens is because of demons, but it is encouraging us to consider that possibility, especially when we see patterns of behavior that are clearly harmful and promote things like division, fear, and control.
So it's about looking for patterns, connecting the dots, and considering whether there might be a spiritual dimension to the problems we're facing.
Exactly. It's about developing that spiritual awareness that can help us understand what's really going on in the world.
Okay, but that brings up another question. If these organizations are so powerful, if they're really being backed by these unseen forces, how can we as individuals actually make a difference?
That's where faith comes in.
Mhm.
The sermon emphasizes that our power doesn't come from ourselves. It comes from our connection to something greater than ourselves, to God. It says that through prayer, through aligning our lives with God's will, and through actively resisting evil, we can tap into a power that's way stronger than any earthly force.
So it's about recognizing our own spiritual authority and then actually using it.
Yes, exactly. It's about understanding that we're not just passive observers in this spiritual battle. We all have a part to play, and we have the power to make a real difference.
This sermon is really making me think about my own role in all of this. It's making me think about how I can use my own influence, even if it seems small, to fight back against these negative forces and do something positive.
I think that's a great takeaway from this. The sermon is reminding us that we all have a responsibility to be a light in the world, to stand up for what's right, and to use our voices and actions to create a better future.
I'm really interested to hear more about the specific things the sermon says we can do to engage in this spiritual battle. What are some of the practical steps it suggests?
Well, the sermon really emphasizes prayer as this powerful tool, and it encourages us to pray specifically against those demonic influences that we see out there in the world, especially those that are impacting, the decisions made by people in authority.
So, and not just like praying in general, but being really intentional about focusing our prayers on those areas where we see those negative forces at work.
Yeah, exactly. And the sermon even gives some examples like praying for leaders, to have wisdom and discernment, to be free from corruption and manipulation, and to make choices that are actually for the good of everyone, not just for their own selfish gain.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's like recognizing that there might be this spiritual dimension to the issues that we see playing out in the world.
Hmm. And it also talks about the importance of, living our own lives in a way that aligns with our faith.
Yeah.
It says that when we try to be truthful and just and compassionate in our everyday lives, we're actively pushing back against those forces of darkness.
So it's not just about what we do in our private prayer time, but also how we actually live out our faith in our interactions with others.
Exactly. It's about being that light in the darkness, being a force for good in our families, our communities, our workplaces. It's about shining a light on those places where we see injustice and corruption and speaking up against it.
It sounds like the sermon is calling for Christians to be really active in their faith and to not be afraid to confront the tough issues we're facing.
Yeah, definitely. It talks about how important it is to be informed, to understand what's really going on, and to use our voices and actions to advocate for positive change.
We talked earlier about the sermon's claim that these big organizations are actually being influenced by demonic forces, and you mentioned some specific examples of the kinds of actions that the sermon uses to support that idea. Could you maybe give us a few more details about those examples? What exactly is the sermon pointing to?
It highlights things like, the push for policies that restrict individual freedoms and, erode privacy and concentrate power in the hands of just a small group of people. It points to those situations where these organizations seem to care more about profits than people, often at the expense of the environment or the well-being of vulnerable people.
So it's about looking at the impact of their decisions, who's benefiting and who's getting hurt.
Exactly. And it's about asking, do these actions line up with values of compassion and justice and respect for human dignity? The sermon really encourages us to be critical thinkers, to question what we're being told, and to hold those in power accountable for their choices.
Wow, this has really given me a lot to think about. It's such a different way of looking at the world. It really encourages us to think beyond what we see and consider that there might be these unseen forces at work.
It has for me, too.
Yeah.
And it's also a good reminder that we're not powerless against these challenges. We can choose how we respond. We can make a difference in our own little corners of the world. And we can choose to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem.
I think that's a great point to end on. This deep dive has been a wild ride. We've explored history and theology and current events, and it's definitely left us with a lot to ponder. What's one last thought you want to leave with our listeners, something they can take with them as they continue on their own journeys?
If this conversation has resonated with you at all, if it's made you question things or rethink the forces that are shaping our world, then I really encourage you to keep searching for truth. Listen to that inner voice and trust your own discernment as you figure out how you can be a force for good. You have more power than you think.
Well said. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.
I hope you enjoyed that discussion and found it thought-provoking. There are 10 quiz questions for you to answer in the video description if you wish. And to watch the original video and find the answers to the quiz, then follow the link on the end screen shown on this video. God bless.